In part one of the Founding Fathers Set Us Up for Failure, we discussed the history that followed the development of the Constitution, or the writing of the Constitution by the framers, and how they were really unaware of what was going to happen in the future because they came from an agrarian society, and it was going to be a long time before we became a technological and industrial country. If you take someone who's been isolated from the modern world and put them in the world today and had them have a conversation with Elon Musk, you'd kind of know what I mean. They wouldn't have an idea of what's going on for now or the future. And that's kind of the way the Founding Fathers were. They were bright guys, and they knew a lot about government and structure because they had a history of that in England and the rest of Europe. But as far as being able to predict the future, they really weren't great futurists. In the second part of the discussion on how the Founding Fathers set us up for failure, we're going to discuss how your representation has been watered down and why. That watered down representation allowed a proportionally smaller number of people to control the federal government and to take over the power from the states. And doing that, they diminished your power as an individual. Let's look at where we are now. We have 2 senators for every state. We have 435 representatives for Congress, and those are capped at 435. There won't be any more. In 1790, there was about 1 elected official in the federal government for every 47,000 people. Now we're looking at a number of about 1 elected official for every 600 and something thousand people. So it set us up for a big failure and a big change in the balance of power from states to the federal government. Well, how in the world could a situation like this happen where your representation was diluted so much? Well, it's easy. The 1913 Congress changed it. This cap was not put in place by the Constitution. It was put in place by Congress. I think that was Woodrow Wilson at that time was president. But at any rate, wasn't done by the Constitution or the founders, and they didn't put anything in place to keep it from happening. So we were set up right there. Definitely, your representation's been watered down. The Founding Fathers never envisioned the speed at which the country would grow. The growth of population, of course, a lot of it was immigration. There's a lot of immigrants in the U.S., a lot of sons and daughters of immigrants. They also didn't envision better health care, better transportation, even more babies surviving childbirth. They didn't see that coming. They didn't see food production growing to meet the demands of the population and exceed the demands of the population. So there were other factors too, but those are kind of the main ones. The failure, they didn't put a system in place that keeps representation at a reasonable level for the number of people in the population. The politicians knew this would give them more power as the population kept growing, and they set about to make sure it happened. They knew they had the power to make laws that essentially changed the balance of power and reduced the power of the states. And by doing so, reduced your power too. And I promise you that Congress knew that this would give them more power as the population grew. They also delegated a lot of their authority to the bureaucracy and to the departments. After 1913, we had 3 branches of government and a 4th de facto branch of government that was unelected. It's now the 4th and largest branch of the government. The Founding Fathers were really a bunch of ethical guys, and they really were trying to create a framework for the government that would work and would last. They, of course, didn't envision some of these things happening, and they didn't put provisions into the document, the Constitution, to prevent it from happening. So it happened, and the responsibility lays on our elected officials. The elected officials wanted more power, and it became a situation where the only way they could get the power was by reducing the representation that it gave to the people. Now we have a political bureaucracy that's primary function is job one. Their self-preservation is their strongest instinct. And I just don't believe the Founding Fathers meant for this to happen. They didn't think anybody would want to be a politician for life. These guys gave some of their time to run the government, but they didn't want to be there forever. But the Congress later had a different idea, and that was to stay there forever and stay in power forever. The thing that gave them the ability to do that was the durability of the bureaucracy. It allowed them to maintain control of the people or past their time in office. They could pass it on. It was basically a permanent branch of government that just changed with attrition and new hires. Now what you have is a government, especially the bureaucracy, and you really don't have any word in it. They can pass rules that affect you without even talking to the Congress. There's a lot of examples of rules that they passed to increase the power of government. And Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, that was supposed to pull the country out of a deep depression that they call the Great Depression. It probably laid the groundwork for the most significant increase in the size of the federal government than anyone ever had seen. Congress allowed and encouraged the bureaucracy to grow. These things allowed people that were in power to stay in power. And what you have there is the creation of the swamp. The swamp gets a lot of talk lately, and by gosh, it really should, because it's a serious part of the problem that the Founding Fathers created for us. You know, these people plan to stay in power forever. The congressmen definitely plan to stay in power. They set up a pension program for themselves. If they didn't intend to stay in power, they certainly wouldn't have done that. They also aren't supportive of term limits. Term limits are only discussed before elections, never after. But I still think the congressional pension program is the most telling thing, that they plan to stay there and stay in power. And I'm not saying this is a Republican or a Democratic thing. This is a politician thing. The politicians, they don't care who comes and goes. They just want their time in office, and as much of it as they can get. So you can see these elected officials, of course, are looking forward to that pension. But even bigger than that, they're looking for ways to empower and enrich their friends and family. And it happens all the time. It's undeniable. There's examples of it every day. We see it in the news, and people say, oh, well, it's not really illegal. Well, it may not be illegal, but it really is immoral and unethical. The intent of the founders was not to put people in office and set them up for life and enrich them and enrich their family. It was to govern the people, for the people, by the people, all that. And apparently, somewhere along the line, didn't work. And the Founding Fathers, they set us up for that, although I don't think it was really intentional. Even though we have elections and everything, it's really a front. You're not going to change anything. Part 3 of this series is called A Small Target. And that's going to show you how 542 elected officials are targeted by everyone, by big business, by labor unions, by the bureaucracy itself, to basically stay in power and to make sure that changes don't happen. Only minor things will happen, but big changes to government that give you more representation in the government aren't going to happen. And they have absolutely made sure it won't happen. I hope you'll stay with us for part 3. Part 3, I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about how this mess all came about, and see what you think about it. I know what I think about it, and I'll try to tell you that too. If you enjoy this video, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and set that notification bell so you won't miss another part of this 3-part series. This is JR, the expat in Saigon, saying thank y'all for watching.